You know what's the biggest pain in the ass in the world? Trying to display your Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. Look at this shit. I have to put them inside of those binder baseball thingies. They're a pain in the ass to take out, too. The reason I bring up Game Boy Advance is because today we're doing a GBA review, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 for the Game Boy Advance. Now before we dive into this, I want to take you back to the late 90s and early 2000s when Tony Hawk games were the shit. They were amazing, and they were so much fun. You couldn't go anywhere without anyone talking about the next game in the series or showing off their skills on the current game in the series. This game was remarkably fun to play with friends too, especially when you got to show them what you could do that they couldn't and vice versa. You taught each other how to do certain tricks and how to play as certain characters to accomplish certain goals. Basically, these games were a hell of a lot of fun and were developed by the studio called Neversoft, who you may be familiar with because they developed a little game you may have heard of called Guitar Hero 3. So I just wanted to take you back to the days when Tony Hawk and his games were kind of the big deal. As a matter of fact, some of Neversoft's best-selling games on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 were the Pro Skater games, along with Guitar Hero, of course. So, knowing this and knowing how successful Tony Hawk, his career, and his games were, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 on the Game Boy can't be that bad. I mean, there's a lot of elements to make it interesting and fun. It's fucking terrible. So, this is Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 on the Game Boy Advance, huh? Not gonna lie, it kinda looks like fucking shit. I can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to take the 3D aesthetic from the actual console games and bring it onto the mobile platforms, but it didn't work. Yeah, that's my character right there, Hellboy. Ooh, I was such a badass. Don't make fun of me, I was young and stupid. Now, the first thing that anyone in the right mind would notice when they first pick up this game would be the god-awful control scheme. Jesus Christ, what did they do? This doesn't feel at all like Pro Skater. It feels like I'm controlling a tank. The controls can be swapped depending on which footing you use. So sometimes if you're facing left and you press right and you expect to go right, you'll go left instead, which is really, really annoying. Now, I know what you're thinking. If you can switch the controls, why don't you just not switch them and just play how it's intended? Trust me, I would love to do that, but the tricks and combos are so hard to pull off that I end up button mashing and switching my control scheme anyways. Nowhere in this game itself does it explicitly tell you how to do any of the combos, so you either have to refer to the game manual if you even have it, or just button mash your way through it. And this is a bad thing because, as I just explained, button mashing can lead to fucking up your footing, which can unfortunately also lead to fucking up the game! Now, enough about the controls themselves, let's get into the actual gameplay. It's mission based, meaning that you have to go through missions in order to progress later in the game. This mission in particular makes you find 5 people who look similar and tell them about a party, I think. But the problem is, how do you distinguish between guys that you're supposed to tell the party about and guys you're supposed to ignore? How does this guy look any different from this guy aside from a change of clothes, even if that? Some people don't even have a change of clothes, they just use the exact same character model. How about putting an exclamation point over their head, or having a little dot on a map somewhere? How come I have to guess and see which fucking guys I have to slam into in order to talk about a fucking party? Great, now I'm stuck in a half pipe. I'm stuck in a fucking half pipe in a Tony Hawk game. Do you notice a problem? Of course, then there's the bullshit where you have to click the 5 letters on one rail. Nowhere in this game does it tell you how to grind on a rail, mind you. You're just assumed to know it. Now, you want to know what the biggest problem is? Keep an eye on that score system. I'm just going to do a couple tricks. You keep an eye on there. I promise you there is no special editing or any funny effects or whatever. Just keep an eye on that word, score, and the number next to it. So the score, yeah, funny story about the score in this game. Let me explain it. It doesn't work, like, at all. How? How could this have happened to a frickin' Tony Hawk game, a Pro Skater game, one of the greatest series of all time by one of the greatest developers of the 6th generation? How could it have turned out this bad? Perhaps I'm looking at the wrong angle. Perhaps it was a problem earlier in development, like an earlier game. Let's look at the 3rd game on the Game Boy Color and see if that's any different. Well, right off the bat, the music's a hell of a lot better. Certainly a lot more enjoyable than the crappy Sega Genesis wannabe music. Speaking of the music, it doesn't actually play during the game itself, only on the title screen and menu screens, which is weird. Gameplay-wise, it's a hell of a lot better than the 4th game, by miles. The game itself is entirely 2D, which brings up a really good point. Was there a specific reason that they tried to make Pro Skater 4 on the Game Boy Advance 3D? I love software and hardware ambition as much as the next guy, but you shouldn't push a console to do something that it wasn't meant to do. There was a Resident Evil game on the Game Boy Color, haven't heard of it, because Capcom canceled it. They knew that the Game Boy Color couldn't handle Resident Evil. Now, if Capcom was smart enough to know that Resident Evil wasn't going to work on the Game Boy Color, who, in the name of flying shit, thought that Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 is going to work on a Game Boy Advanced? Again, perhaps I'm not looking back far enough. Let's look at the very first game that Neversoft ever created for the genre and see if that holds up better than the fourth game that a different company created. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 on the Nintendo 64. Or, I'm sorry, Tony Hawk Skateboarding. Oh god. They have the Gyromite thing going on where it's a different title as to the one that's on the cartridge anyways. This game surprisingly still actually kind of holds up. The audio side of things isn't really the greatest because of Nintendo 64 needing to use cartridges. They had to smush down all the sound effects and music, but the gameplay is still there. I feel like I'm playing a Tony Hawk Pro Skater game. Graphics-wise, it's also a hell of a lot better than the fourth game in the franchise. The first game in the franchise is better than the fourth, and I know that it's technically inferior hardware, but that still says something. We're going backwards here. All in all, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 is still a pretty goddamn good game considering its age. It's still a hell of a lot of fun to play, and it still holds up after all these years. So let's just beg the question, what the hell happened? Was Tony Hawk just never meant to be put on a mobile platform? Because it works fine on the consoles. Maybe Neversoft's coding standards just couldn't get met back then. But that's still no excuse to release it. That's like if I decided to take a shit in a plastic bag and then left it inside of a Walmart parking lot. Actually, that's being too nice. This game's worse than a piece of shit inside of a Walmart bag. Now, don't get me wrong. I am aware that there is an even worse Tony Hawk Pro Skater game. It came out recently and it was a major letdown. Trust me, I will get to that eventually, I promise you. As for next time, though, I think it's time that we hit up some older school games, you know? Like, what's this one? I'm sure that this one can't be too bad. Shit!